Welcome to today's Explainer. All right, we are going to dive right in. Today, we're totally deconstructing the true underlying mechanics of leadership and power. Honestly, you can just forget those vague generalities about culture, history, or civic virtue that they taught us in high school. Instead, we're going to look at the exact literal mechanics, the hidden rules that determine exactly why leaders behave the way they do. And trust me on this, it's a fascinating, if kind of ruthless picture.
So what if everything you thought you knew about political power was just wrong? We're constantly asking ourselves how these brutal tyrants manage to hold on to power for decades. Or, on the flip side, why highly paid CEOs somehow keep their jobs even when their companies completely tank. We tend to think, oh, these are just weird anomalies, or they just have incredibly flawed personalities. But here is the crucial takeaway. They are not anomalies at all. No, they're simply playing a game, and they are playing it by a very, very strict set of rules.
Our main framework today comes straight from this amazing book, The Dictators Handbook, written by political scientists Bruce Bueno de Mesquita and Alastair Smith. Their core argument is probably going to challenge your baseline assumptions. They argue that bad behavior is almost always good politics. Crazy, right? But to understand why leaders do terrible things, we first have to understand what they actually want. And what they want above absolutely everything else is to come to power and then to stay in power.
Okay, Section 1. The illusion of absolute power. Literally the biggest mistake we make when analyzing politics is assuming that leaders can just act unilaterally. Absolute power? It's a total myth. Take this famous quote, often attributed to France's Sun King, Louis XIV, "The state, it is me." It perfectly captures our romanticized idea of this monolithic absolute monarch, right? Well, actually, it's completely false. When Louis took control, France was pretty much bankrupt. That meant he couldn't pay off his essential supporters. So to avoid being overthrown by the old military aristocrats, he literally had to shuffle his entire inner circle. He brought in brand new loyalists, even commoners, and he tied their personal wealth directly to his survival. He didn't rule alone, he just expertly managed the exact people he relied on to stay on top.
Moving right along to Section 2, the 3 dimensions of politics. So the authors call this structure the Selectorate theory. And the crazy thing is, it applies universally. We're talking dictatorships, democracies, even massive corporations. It's the structural blueprint of basically all human organizations. Here's how it breaks down. First, up at the top, you have the nominal selectorate, or the interchangeables. This is literally everyone with at least some legal say, like all registered voters in a country. Next level down is the real selectorate, or the influentials. These are the folks who actually participate and choose the leader, like the voters who actually bother to show up and cast a ballot. And finally, you have the absolute most important group, the winning coalition, the essentials. These are the specific, vital people whose support actually guarantees victory. So in the US, that's the voters who actually secure those 270 electoral college votes. But for a dictator, that might just be a handful of key loyal generals.
Okay, so how do you actually take command of these groups? Well, it boils down to a purely mechanical 3-step process. Step 1, remove the incumbent. Step 2, seize control of the treasury. And Step 3, sufficiently reward your coalition. Take Sergeant Samuel Doe over in Liberia back in 1980. He was a virtually illiterate army private. He literally just walked into the president's bedroom, assassinated him, declared himself the new president, seized the country's money, and then immediately paid off his fellow soldiers. 3 simple, brutal, and highly effective steps to seize command.
All right, let's look at Section 3, the 5 rules to rule.
So getting into power is one thing, but staying there? That's way harder. Here is the highly cynical but entirely logical playbook for political survival. Number 1, keep your winning coalition as small as possible. Fewer people to pay off means you have way more control. Number 2, keep your nominal selectorate as large as possible. This creates a massive pool of potential replacements, which essentially keeps your essentials absolutely terrified of losing their spot. Number 3, take control of the treasury. Basically, he who holds the purse strings holds the power. Number 4, pay your essentials just enough to keep them loyal, but definitely not enough to make them financially independent. And finally, number 5, never ever take money from your essentials to make everyday people's lives better.
There is just a brutal, undeniable efficiency to that first rule. The smaller the winning coalition, the fewer people to satisfy. This right here is the mathematical engine of autocracy. Think about it. If you only need 5 generals to stay in power, you can afford to make those 5 generals unbelievably rich. But if you have a massive winning coalition, like millions of voters in a modern democracy, you literally can't buy them all off individually. There's just not enough money. The math simply doesn't work.
Which brings us to Section 4, public versus private goods.
So, the size of a leader's essential coalition completely changes how they are forced to spend the organization's money. It's a night and day difference. Leaders with a large coalition, like in democracies, have to buy loyalty through public goods. We're talking things that benefit everybody, like clean drinking water, interstate highways, and national defense. Why? Because handing out physical envelopes of cash to 50 million people is literally impossible. But leaders with a small coalition, like autocracies, they secure loyalty through exclusive, private goods. Since there are so few essentials to keep happy, the leader can literally just hand them bags of cash, massive government contracts, and total legal impunity.
Let's zoom in a bit for Section 5, a dictatorship in miniature. Now, you might be wondering, does this massive, sweeping geopolitical theory actually apply to our everyday local lives? Oh, absolutely. Welcome to Bell, California. Now, on the surface, this looks like a completely normal, working-class suburb of Los Angeles with, about 36,000 residents. But behind that perfectly idyllic facade, the leaders of Bell were actually secretly operating their entire town under the exact mechanical rules of a small coalition dictatorship.
Just consider this absolutely staggering number for a second. $787,000. That was the annual salary of Bell's city manager, a guy named Robert Rizal. Just for some context here, the actual president of the United States makes $400,000. So Rizzo basically executed Rule 3 perfectly. He seized control of the treasury, and he used it to massively enrich himself and his tiny little coalition of city council members. He was paying them nearly $100,000 a year each for doing practically nothing.
But how on earth do they afford to pay themselves that much? Well, by mercilessly squeezing the interchangeables. Bell's property tax rate was at an astronomical 1.55%. That is roughly 50% higher than ultra-wealthy neighboring communities like Beverly Hills or Malibu. It's insane. Rizzo and the council were following Rule 5 to the letter. They heavily taxed the masses to make absolutely sure their tiny group of essentials got massive private rewards.
And check this out. Here is Rule 1 perfectly in action. 473. That is the absurdly tiny number of votes it actually took to win a city council seat in Bell. Out of 36,000 residents, the essentials, the actual winning coalition, was practically microscopic. By depending on so few people, the town's leaders had massive, unchecked discretion to just loot the treasury. So, how did they legally get away with setting this up? Well, they cleverly manipulated a low-turnout special election to change Bell's status from a general city, where all decisions are overseen by the state in broad daylight, to a charter city, where decisions can basically be made behind closed doors. They held this highly technical election knowing full well that nobody would show up. In fact, fewer than 400 voters actually passed it. They purposely minimized their winning coalition just to evade state oversight. It's a textbook power grab.
Now, zooming back out to the global stage for a second, I want to briefly touch on a totally counterintuitive finding from the sources, the illusion of foreign aid. We all naturally think that sending foreign aid helps oppressed people, right? But remember the rules we just learned. For a dictator operating with a small coalition, foreign aid is literally just free money injected straight into the treasury. Instead of giving it to the starving masses, they just use it to buy even more private goods for their essential supporters. So the aid actually entrenches the dictator and makes them even stronger.
Okay, let's wrap up with Section 6, how to fix the system.
So if the game is inherently rigged to reward awful behavior, what can we actually do about it? Well, the mechanical solution is to forcibly enlarge that winning coalition. You basically have to make it mathematically impossible for a leader to rely on a tiny group of essentials. By strengthening democratic institutions, expanding who actually gets to vote, reducing the power of unchecked elites, and absolutely forcing transparency, like, ending those closed-door meetings in Bell, California, you force the leader to rely on public goods to survive rather than just handing out private payoffs.
Which leaves us with this final, pretty provocative thought. If the game of power is entirely defined by the size of the winning coalition, I want you to look at your own life. Look at your own workplace, your local government, or even your nation. Are you an interchangeable or are you an essential? And honestly, more importantly, what can you do to expand the coalition around you, to force better behavior from those sitting at the top? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this sparked your curiosity. Now go out there and start rethinking the rules.